Hello and welcome to this Jigsaw Education Group webinar with me, Joanna Feast. Today we're going to be looking at how PSHE is pivotal to a thriving school culture. And I'd like to start by taking you through the 4 intentions of today's learning. Firstly, I'd like to be able to offer you, staff, a greater appreciation of how to develop and also embed inclusive values in school using Jigsaw PSHE resources. We'll also look at how we can offer an opportunity in school and also today for you to reflect on your work and how you already contribute to a strengths-based whole system approach to well-being, to health, to inclusion and to achievement. We'll also look at how personal development and SMSC can have a positive impact on an inclusive, respectful and accepting environment. And then finally, and it's a big one, we're going to be looking at how we can show that supportive signposting alongside proactive safeguarding procedures and effective leadership and management can champion wellbeing, health and inclusion. So a lot to cover. A bit about me to start off with. I'm Joanna Feast and I'm a Senior Associate Consultant with Jigsaw. I'm a former teacher and also a former local authority school improvement advisor working with Healthy Schools and SEAL, social and emotional aspects of learning. I've been with Jigsaw since the very start, so have been embedded in it for quite a number of years. My career has spanned over 25 years, both in education and in health. And in that time, I've been lucky enough to visit well over 900 schools. So I feel that I can bring something to today's webinar when it comes to the experience of what different schools do. Now, the building blocks of a thriving school culture can be huge. So I've broken them down into 4 different ones. But I think the most important thing about how we build a thriving school culture is to do it with a sense of consistency, to be really considered about it, so no knee-jerk reactions, and to integrate it into our daily approach. There's nothing specific, as it were, that you absolutely must do. It's about how you do it. And that's much more how Jigsaw works. It's the approach that we take as well. Now, these 4 different building blocks of a thriving school culture start with PSHE, of course. We then look at inclusive values. We look then at personal development and SMSC development opportunities. And then we look at signposting, leadership and management, proactive safeguarding. Now, first things first, let's start with our favourite, which is the building block one about PSHE, pedagogy and practice. So the teaching and learning and how this looks in everyday school life. We know from a huge amount of evidence that's been apparent over the past few decades is that PSHE, or whatever you call it in school, can really heavily improve the physical and the psychosocial well-being of pupils. We know that there can be this sort of virtuous circle where pupils with better health and well-being achieve better academically, which in turn leads to greater success. So this basically tells us if we focus on children and young people's better health and well-being, they do better at school. And the way that we can do this is through PSHE. We need to, of course, take a whole school approach here. And that whole school approach to health and well-being is very much linked to pupils' readiness to learn. We've seen post-pandemic how difficult some children find it to come back into school, and their readiness to learn may be not as positive as it might have been before the pandemic. So what we're looking at here is how PSHE can really change children's lives for the better. I'd like to offer you the idea that PSHE is a bit of a mirror to school culture, and it's a good time to ask, what is that reflecting? What is being reflected back? So if you think about it like this, what we're trying to do with PSHE is to teach to pupil need. What is it that pupils need to learn? Because pupils in some schools will not need specifically to learn exactly what is happening in other schools. It's about what is their need. And also I'd like to offer you the really important mantra, I think, is what would you like to see instead? So teach to what you want to see rather than what you don't want to see. And that can really help with your thriving school culture. One of the main ways to ensure success with PSHE is to plan it into the curriculum. Now, when it comes to Ofsted, they will be looking at how subject leaders and teachers identify learning gaps and new starting points. And ostensibly, I'd say that's teaching to pupil need. And then how they respond to that is also another marker that Ofsted inspectors will look at. So what we can take away from this without going too heavily down the Ofsted route is to think about, okay, how can we make sure that our PSHE curriculum meets student needs? Then think about making explicit links between the teaching and learning of PSHE and health-related behaviour change. What I mean by that basically is, what do we want to ensure our pupils can do in terms of their health and well-being? Now, I don't just mean about eating well, sleeping well, and all those sorts of things. It's mental health, psychological health, emotional health, societal health, social health, sexual health. All of these different types of health and well-being are so entrenched in PSHE. We need to actually look at what is the behaviour that is guiding children and young people into making choices, and then look at what's behind the behaviour. Now, this is another course entirely, I'm sure. So what we're here today to look at specifically is a thriving school culture and how this can be achieved through PSHE. So the questions to start asking. If we think about the 3 I's of an Ofsted inspection, then what we're looking at in terms of PSHE is, what is it that we want to do in PSHE? What is our intent? And how can we make sure that our PSHE curriculum is specifically planned to meet our own pupils' needs? Firstly, though, we need to decide, how do we know what those needs are? What data have we got? What baseline assessment could we do? Now, I don't mean anything formal necessarily, but we do need to have a really good data set on which to base where we're coming from with our teaching and learning in PSHE. What are we trying to achieve? And what are we trying to specifically support our children with? Once we've decided that, we can then start to look in terms of implementation. And this is obviously where Jigsaw excels, because it is already a spiral curriculum. And that's what we need to do, is we need to look in the development of children's learning, the progression that they're making, and to build upon that day in, day out, year in, year out. To do that, we need well-trained, competent and confident teaching staff with really good subject knowledge, and also the opportunity to keep on learning themselves. And then to sort of tidy up the circle, as it were, of these 3 I's, think about the impact. What is it that we want to see? How do we know if we've got there? So pupils are prepared for everything that might come in their lives. Now, of course, we can't do absolutely everything in terms of content, but what we can do is teach them the skills that are then transferable to lots of different parts of life, lots of different areas of life that they're going to need those skills for. We know that PSHE contributes not only to these areas that I've already mentioned, but also to improved academic performance, particularly for the children who are most disadvantaged. So I think that's a rousing cry, really, isn't it, to say that we really do need to plan PSHE incredibly well into the curriculum and make sure that teachers are well prepared for that. Our second building block is all about inclusive values. Now, how do we do that? Well, there's 2 main ways to do that. First of all, through your PSHE pedagogy and practice, and we've already looked at this in a bit of detail. The second one is through the Equality Duty of 2010, and most specifically looking at the protected characteristics and how they must be catered for equally. Now, I'm going to drift into a little bit of legal language now, but I think it's important that we establish the baseline for how we can support really inclusive values in our schools in order to support a thriving culture. The public sector equality duty requires that all schools need to ensure that they are doing these 3 things. And although the language is probably quite normalised in everyday parlance, what this actually looks like can be a little bit more detailed. Firstly, we need to ensure in schools that we are eliminating discrimination, harassment, victimisation, or any other conduct that's prohibited by or under the Equality Act 2010. We also need to ensure that we are advancing the quality of opportunity between persons who share relevant protected characteristics and people who do not share it. This will all become clear when I explain it later on exactly what this means, but I wanted to start with the legal bit. And then we also need to foster good relations between people who share protected characteristics and people who do not share. Now, those 9 protected characteristics, just as a quick reminder, are about age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, race, religion or belief, sex and sexual orientation. And the 9 protected characteristics are enshrined by law to ensure that no one who shares these protected characteristics is discriminated against because of those protected characteristics, however many they may share or not share. And so for schools, what they need to consider, and this is where we come back to this thriving school culture, is how do we go about doing this? One of the main ways is to be looking at personal development opportunities. It's one of the key strands of an Ofsted inspection, but it also is a golden thread that runs through all of school life and particularly PSHE provision. Because this is a key strand of Ofsted, we do need to look at what the expectations of an inspection are, and the guidelines for that are incredibly clear, so I'm not going to go over those today. There is specific reference, though, in those guidelines about leadership and management, particularly of relationships education, relationships and sex education and health education, which are the legally required statutory aspects of PSHE. PSHE remains the subject. It always has been called that, and it always, well, hopefully always will be. And there are sections of it that are statutory, but it does not cover the whole of PSHE. So just bear that in mind when you're looking at the whole of your PSHE provision. And if you're using Jigsaw PSHE as your provision in school, you will know that absolutely the statutory parts are covered, but there are also other bits too, I should say, and there are other bits too that are not statutory and I believe are equally important. As part of what you need to consider as a school, you need to think about what works well and where the gaps might be in your provision and how to fill them. Using Jigsaw PSHE, which is universal provision as opposed to targeted provision, you'll know that it covers absolutely everything in the statutory guidance plus more. And if you need more in order to meet the needs of your pupils, it is up to you as a school to ensure that you are doing that. And of course, we at Jigsaw PSHE can help you with that. You need to ensure that you are meeting these needs appropriately and effectively, and to be able to show how you're doing that. That can also be covered in your PSHE planning, in your policy, to ensure your policy and your provision link. The two cannot be absolutely separate beings. And through all of this, you're going to be able to come up with a way that will hopefully ensure the authentic inclusion, not just the paying lip service inclusion, but the absolute authentic inclusion, so that everybody in your school and the wider school community feels included. How do you go about doing this, though? Well, we know from the statutory guidance and from Ofsted that all primary and secondary schools should be able to demonstrate that no form of discrimination is tolerated and that pupils show respect for those who share protected characteristics. But what we need to be really clear on is that we cannot just glibly state in a generalised policy that we encourage respect for all people or other such words. We need to show absolutely how this is inclusive authentically. Now, how do we go about teaching this? Well, as I'm sure you know, schools are absolutely not required to teach about all the protected characteristics in every year group. That's absolutely for schools to decide and how you go about it. But it should be planned and delivered so that children develop age-appropriate knowledge and understanding whilst they're at school. And in secondary schools, in an age and stage-appropriate way, this should also include knowledge about the protected characteristics of sexual orientation and gender reassignment. How do we go about doing this? Well, everything should be integrated into the curriculum rather than addressed separately or in one-off lessons. And if you're using Jigsaw PSHE, you know that that's coming off really well in your school. So a final thing to leave you with to consider is how are you integrating these protected characteristics, not just into the curriculum, but also into conversations at school, how you speak about yourself and others. How are you living these values in school? Not just demonstrating them and teaching them in lessons, but how are you living them authentically? And then thinking about how you're highlighting the difference between teaching content and fostering an inclusive culture in your school. Moving on now to building block 3. This is all about personal development and SMSC development opportunities in a bit more detail. We've already looked at this previously because everything's intrinsically linked. But if we want to pull these apart, then this is what this one's all about. Spiritual, moral, social, cultural development opportunities are the sort of overriding umbrella that encompasses personal development in the whole curriculum. You can't just plonk this in the world of PSHE and hope for the best. This is across the whole of the school. And what we're looking at is improving ways to provide for the personal development of pupils and ensuring a really high quality with which you as a school implement this work. So for this, we obviously need to look at the impact of your provision for personal development, but also note, as with all things to do with personal development and PSHE, these things may not be accessible whilst a pupil is at school. So bear in mind that you might need to wait 5, 10, 15, 20, maybe even 50 years for some of these skills to come to their fruition. And that's okay. I think it's worth noting, though, that what we need to do is look at what does this look like within a school and what's better practice and what's perhaps poorer practice. So if we go back to basics, thinking about opportunities for effective SMSC personal development and inclusive values, this all helps to develop resilience, self-esteem. It helps to ensure better and more effective safeguarding, and all comes back to a thriving school culture. But what does this actually look like? So if we look at resilience in particular, this is often quite a played around with term. And so from a PSHE perspective, what does that look like? And I think it's worth looking at then what is emotional resilience as a more specific way of examining a resilience. Really what we're looking at here is a person's ability to be able to adapt to stressful situations and to cope with the ups and downs that life brings. It is absolutely not about eliminating stress or getting rid of life's difficulties, but it is very much about allowing people to tackle, to accept problems, to live through adversity with the appropriate skills to do so, and to move forwards with life. It's less about saying, for me, bouncing back. It's more about bouncing forwards. And how do we do this in schools? Well, there's two ways. There's a really positive way and there's a not quite so positive way. So when it goes well, what we're looking at here is the thing in PSHE and around school. Emotional resilience is explicitly taught as a skill. It's explicitly practiced and encouraged in all parts of school life, and it's modelled by the adults as well. And this in turn helps to build self-esteem and self-awareness, one of the most important things, and it contributes to thriving school culture, and easy to see why. Because people feel safe at school and they feel respected. They feel physically safe and also psychologically safe. Now, when it's not working, we have things like bright siding, that always look on the bright side, that stiff upper lip, that toxic positivity, forced fun, reference to grit, all these sorts of things, positive vibes only, those excruciatingly insincere and inauthentic ways to try to encourage people to lighten up. Now, what we know in PSHE research is that children need to experience and know how to express a wealth of emotions. They shouldn't just slap on a smile and hope for the best. That is not an authentic way of living, and it leads to the repression of emotions, which, the vernacular just tells us isn't great. The research tells us that isn't great as well. So we need to be able to be teaching the skill of emotional resilience. And how do we do that? Well, PSHE, obviously, through SMSC development opportunities. And the guidance from Ofsted about what excellent SMSC development opportunities look like is incredibly clear. So I'll leave you to look at that for yourselves rather than go through it today. We know, though, and the evidence says, so we can definitely see the impact of what we're doing here, is that when we put PSHE, SMSC development opportunities at the heart of school life, they have a really positive impact on an inclusive, respectful and accepting environment, because they explicitly are teaching skills. We can't teach all of the content. We don't have time because it's a crowded curriculum anyway, and the content is legion. So what we need to do instead is focus on the skills. And then finally, it brings us to building block 4, our supportive signposting alongside proactive safeguarding procedures. Very simply speaking, if pupils feel safe at school, both psychologically and physically, if schools are well managed, and if everyone in school knows where to go for help if they need it, this has a direct and positive effect on well-being, on health and inclusion in school, but also beyond school. We know that effective leadership and management really does help to champion better well-being, better health, and better inclusion. If you think about it very simply, a healthier leadership and management team is going to have a ripple effect outwards from SLT. And that is a really positive way of looking at a thriving school culture, starting with leadership and management. What we also need to think about, though, are safeguarding procedures and how they should mirror what is going on in PSHE and vice versa. Same things for policies and signposting, that a lot of children may be taught things in PSHE, but they might not actually come to need some of that information for maybe days, months, years. So it's about having supportive signposting in place in school to ensure that they know where to find it if they need it. So a couple of things for you to consider. Think about, does your school's behaviour or relationships policy, and by that I mean what used to be called the behaviour policy, not relationships and sex education, do they mirror the approach that you take and what you teach in PSHE? So often there can be this mismatch or disconnect between what is taught, that everyone's welcome, that everyone's safe, but actually the behaviour policy or relationships policy does not mirror that. So ensure that the two are mirrored, and then you get that sense of authentic words matching actions, actions matching words. Does your safeguarding policy and practice reflect effective PSHE principles? We know what these are. These are reflected all the way through Jigsaw PSHE. Do the two connect? Then think about, are all staff clear on what and how to teach, specifically using the Jigsaw PSHE resources? So often it can feel a bit of a rush to say, oh, we need to do this, we need to teach that. You're doing this scheme now. Are people clear on what they're doing and how to do it well and why they're doing it as well? And also, can you discover if pupils know where to access support if and when they need it? Making sure that it is not overwhelming in its content, but it is also easy to find. And this is where Jigsaw PSHE resources can come in. But I will say at this point, having mentioned about Jigsaw resources, we also need to be thinking about the Jigsaw PSHE approach, because it's not just what you teach, it's how you set up your lessons and how you extend the principles of good PSHE throughout your whole school day. And so some questions to ask yourself, if you would like, just to start the reflection process, is what is the climate in the classroom like? Your classroom, the classrooms that you teach in, other people's classrooms. Are you as a teacher or your colleagues as teachers congruent and authentic? A lot of Jigsaw is based on a therapeutic approach, as I'm sure you're aware. And one of the influences of that was Carl Rogers's work, The 3 Core Ways of Being. And 2 of those are about congruency, so words matching actions, actions matching words, and authenticity. Children and young people are absolutely great at identifying someone who is inauthentic, where things don't connect and where they don't feel safe. So think about how you can encourage congruency and authenticity in your school. And then think about empathy. Is it possible for everybody to be fully empathetic? Possibly not. We've got to think about those in the neurodivergent community, others who haven't been taught the skills of empathy. So is there empathy for everybody? And are we able to teach it too? When it comes to the different building blocks, just referring back and how Jigsaw PSHE resources and the approach can support here, the constancy of Jigsaw is that it builds the foundations of children's positive relationships with themselves, first and foremost. It builds on their self-esteem, their self-respect, and their assertiveness skills. And these things just don't happen by osmosis. They need to be practiced, taught, facilitated, rehearsed, and encouraged as much as possible. And then we need to be looking at things specifically, essentially sensitive subjects. And those won't be universally sensitive. Some people find them more sensitive than others, in an age and stage appropriate way. And there is absolutely no space for shock tactics or victim blaming, which you will not find in Jigsaw, obviously. Now, when it comes to the 4 M's, what we're looking at here for healthier behaviour is looking at understanding oneself first and foremost, to then understand other people's behaviour. to focus on building relationships with the self before building relationships with others. You need to be a good friend to yourself before you know how to be a good friend to others, for example. That's the sort of macro way of looking at it. But in terms of the micro, the detail, what we're looking at here is the content of the curriculum in Jigsaw, which is based on skills as opposed to content. And as I mentioned earlier, you can't teach all of the content, so teach the skills that are going to help with the content. The mindfulness philosophy and practice, thinking about the language that we use in our mindfulness practice and our philosophy, and the modelling that we can do here as well, of helping children to pause, to do things on purpose, to act in a way that is considered, and to ensure that there is discernment there as well. We need to pause to be able to access those specific skills. And then the fourth M, mental health. This, as we know, is an absolute prerequisite for successful learning, for health, for happiness, and for positive life choices. And in every single lesson in Jigsaw, there is an overwhelming sense that mental health is focused upon. We may not mention the term, that doesn't mean that we're not looking at it in some detail in every single lesson. Now to inclusive values. Well, in Jigsaw PSHE resources, if you haven't spotted where there's inclusivity, then perhaps you haven't had a good chance to look through it all just yet. We know, though, to feel included, everybody's voice needs to be heard, and pupil voice is absolutely advocated, as well as children's involvement in the school, is really encouraged in every way through Jigsaw PSHE resources. That will be through the charter, for example, so making sure that there's safe and open and positive learning environment. That will be through weekly celebration assemblies. It will be a chance for everybody to feel seen and heard. And also specifically in the curriculum content, and just picking one of the examples, is the whole of the Celebrating Difference puzzle. Moving then on to personal development and SMSC development opportunities. In PSHE, we definitely advocate a whole school approach, and that is shown by the wealth of resources that are available to ensure that everybody in school is looking at the same things in the same time frame and having a chance to celebrate those too. We fully embrace the ethos of Jigsaw to develop positive relationships so that children can enjoy support and trust. We can also then look at our reflection time, because this supports children with their learning and their personal development. We know this from again, decades of research about reflection, how we as adults benefit from that, and therefore how children can too. We have mapped Jigsaw all the way through to SMSC development opportunities throughout, both primary and secondary and early years. And then we've also obviously got a spiral curriculum, and we know that personal development and SMSC development opportunities don't just come in one day at one time. So we need to ensure that we're working progressively and developmentally with those skills too. And then finally, coming to our fourth building block, thinking about signposting. Now, very specifically in the 11 to 16 programme, every single lesson ends with signposting, and there are chances to add that signposting to various different points within the lesson, but also outside of the lesson. Effective leadership and management. This comes through really good training, support and guidance for you, our PSHE subject leaders. And as you'll see, we have a wealth of training and support and guidance materials available to you, included within your package. And then looking at the management tools for both the 3 to 11 and the 11 to 16 programmes, how to monitor PSHE, how to report it, how to evaluate it, how to plan it. All of these things are included within Jigsaw PSHE resources and the approach, because there's always someone at the end of an email or at the end of a phone. But I think one of the things to really focus on here is that when it comes to really good championing of wellbeing, health and inclusion, children need to be empowered to understand themselves and their minds, first of all, and this will help them with their health and well-being, because it helps to combat stress, helps to combat pressure and any influences that may cause them harm. If they fully understand themselves on that journey of self-discovery through Jigsaw PSHE lessons all the way through their school career, then they are far better equipped to be able to make discerning choices within their lives now and later on. Now, pulling it all together, There's a lot that I've shared with you today, so I think it's really important to say avoid overwhelm. Pull together the fundamentals that you feel are crucial for your school in terms of a thriving school culture, and do them well first. Always remember that this is about consistency, being really considered, no knee-jerk reactions, and integrated. So this will support positive relationships, first and foremost with the self, then with others, positive behaviour and authentic inclusion. And remember that it all pivots on your school's intent and your school values. Then thinking about what not to do, because I've explained a whole about things of what to do. Make sure that you're not doing these things, that you don't use scare tactics in your PSHE, and you don't use zero tolerance approaches, because that excludes people. That doesn't create cohesion and connection. What we want to do instead is work on a strengths-based or assets-based approach to appropriate values-based learning. And this comes with a strong evidence base to promote positive behaviour change in children and young people. And if it all becomes a bit much, think about what is the purpose of PSHE. It is to learn and rehearse the skills for positive behaviour change now and in the future. Now, for your next steps, I always like to think about the 5 W's and an H: who, what, when, where, why, and how. And that can help break down what to do next into very manageable chunks. Maybe think about what questions you may have. Always come back to Jigsaw if you've got a question. We will know someone who can help, I'm sure. And all it leaves for me to say is thank you very much for coming today. If you wouldn't mind doing the survey after this training, just to see how well the intentions are met, that would be great. And of course, if you ever have any questions at all, please do let us know. So many thanks for joining us today, and let us know if you have questions.